Most VCs do destroy more value than they add. I always say my first company was great market timing and mediocre market and bad execution. So if you can choose great markets and you have great market timing, you should probably go invest. So that's why we end up giving these companies the resources to help create more leverage. If a company could end up having a chief revenue officer at the seat, or a chief people officer, or recruiters, and they had the budget to do that, they're probably going to be able to create more output. So all we're trying to do is help our companies create more output however they want to do it, not the way that we're telling them to do it. And that's a really distinct difference.
Hey climbers, welcome back to another episode of Climb by VSC. Today I'm thrilled to have on Jason Shuman, general partner of Primary Ventures, a dear friend and an early stage investor. Jason leads new investments at Primary across built world, fintech, and marketplaces. You and I have known each other for, I'm coming up on a decade now, so this is going to be a little bit more of a chill, I don't know, chill, but it'll be a very laid-back conversation. I want to start by saying thank you so much for joining me on the show.
Appreciate you having me. Man, times have changed. You're married, you have a baby now, and I still look like I'm 12.
I was going to say, I think you have figured out the secret. There's probably a portrait somewhere of Dorian Gray in your apartment that's aging while you stay young. Meanwhile, I've got the grays going on, so.
Skincare, man. Skincare.
Well, you got to put me onto your routine. Do you think, you know how we do the show, we love to kind of jump in a little bit to your background and then talk about some of the awesome stuff you're doing at Primary. Think your story of founder selling footwear to becoming an investor at Primary, that's pretty well covered. Not a lot of people listening to the show know about your time driving for Uber. So maybe let's go in there a little bit. Are there any lessons from driving for Uber that carry with you now when you're evaluating founders as a VC?
It's a great question. So when I started my direct-to-consumer company, I was 20 years old. I was in college at the University of Miami, and I ran that business for a year in school and then a year out. And I remember a year out of school, I was burnt out. And there's a lot of founders experiencing burnout right now. And my version of burnout was I wasn't thinking about my company in the shower anymore. And that meant I couldn't really problem solve day to day. And I felt like I couldn't imagine myself doing this for the next 10 years. And I was 25 pounds heavier than I am now. I was not thinking about my business, and all my other friends were doing cool things out in the world. And when I realized that I didn't want to really do it anymore, I didn't want to bring everybody else along with me for that journey. So I decided to wind down the business, and that's when I decided, hey, I got to go figure out my next thing. So what did I do? I heard about this thing called venture capital. I didn't know how to get into venture capital, but I learned that if I could do the job before I had the job, then I'd be able to get the job. So during the day, I used to go out and source deals for VC funds in New York for free. I would meet with founders and I'd say, hey, I'm going to introduce you to VCs in New York. I just need to understand your business.
You're like a scout without a scout firm to back.
Scout without a checkbook. And, that was great, but I had $500 in my bank account, so how was I going to make money? Well, there was this company called Uber that was really young at the time. This was 2014. And I would go out in Boston at night. I would drive for basically 3 or 4 hours a night. To answer your question specifically, how does it help me? Man, the amount of people that hop in that car that you need to or might want to build rapport with, it ranges in all types of backgrounds. Now, lucky enough, one of the people that ended up getting into that car was this guy, Ben Jubis. Ben Jubis was in private equity at the time in Boston. He ended up joining a venture capital firm years later called Avenir. Now, Avenir ended up becoming the lead investor of a portfolio company of ours at Primary called Latch. And so me chatting with Ben in that car, me telling Ben about my startup before, and that being one of his first ever rides in Uber, I think left a lasting impact in his mind. So when we actually reconnected years later, I didn't even know that I drove Ben in an Uber.
But he remembered you?
But I went up to him to go shake his hand and said, hey, I'm Jason, nice to meet you. He goes, no, we met. We met years ago. You drove me for Uber, and I'll never forget that ride because of the fact that my Uber driver was an entrepreneur.
That's incredible. What a great story. And that relationship coming full circle however many years later. It's kind of crazy because I think about that too, where I'm definitely you know me, I'm the chatty type. I'll chat with my Uber driver. You never know where people end up in life, right? And I think that's a phenomenal example of that story. Now, we've seen the New York ecosystem, you and I, evolving over the last decade, right? And for folks that don't know, Jason used to host these amazing table talk, I don't even call them panel, happy hours, whatever it was called, with great young investors. Many of us have now gone on to become GPs of our own funds. But we've also seen the ecosystem really change and mature and become a tech hub New York has over the last decade. Contrast that with some of the other places that you and I have invested: Miami, Austin, LA, outside of the Bay Area. I mean, what are some of these other cities missing ingredients-wise that New York has figured out?
So what most people don't realize is that these things aren't built in a day. Rome was not built in a day. The New York tech ecosystem was not built in a day. When I decided to move to New York City, it was incredibly intentional back in 2015 to join a venture fund. The reason why I wanted to join a fund in New York was I felt like it was going to be the next best hub. Why? Well, let's think about that. Incredible amount of customers here in New York. I mean, Wall Street's here. You have every major advertising agency here. You have major fashion brands here. You know, when your customers are here, that's incredibly important. The second thing is, after the financial crisis, we had floods of people from consulting firms and Wall Street and law firms going into the tech ecosystem who were incredibly talented, incredibly sharp, but didn't have operating experience at startups. So what ended up happening post-financial crisis, and part of the reason why Primary wanted to double down and go very long on New York City tech, was the idea that smart people will be able to build big companies, but an ecosystem is built off of people that have seen scale. And so the ecosystem, which used to only have a few hundred seed deals a year done back in, the 2010 to 2014 range, is now almost as close to SF from a seed volume perspective. And the reason being is people saw companies go from 0 to $1 billion, they left, then they started new companies. And that is the number one reason why New York ended up taking off. Whereas Miami, for instance, I went to college at the University of Miami, love the U. That is an ecosystem where they haven't seen that scale before, and the customers aren't all there. Now, sure, the capital's there, but maybe they're not people who are in the prime of their capital deployment careers. So we can get into that maybe in a second. But I do think that there's a lot of really, really good companies that are being built in Miami today, but it will take another 10 to 20 years in order for an ecosystem like that to really catch up to something like New York.
Yeah, I think you're right. Kevin Ryan and I were actually chatting about this at the NYC Tech Awards where he got honored, and his big feedback was about talent density. And he was saying, look at the universities, and whenever you see talent density in a university, he singled out Miami, but I'm sure you could apply that to a lot of places. I think it's talent density plus capital density, which you talked about. Customer density is not one that I considered, but it obviously makes a lot of sense. If you're selling to software companies and you're in the Bay Area, that's where your customers are. You're selling to back then advertising. Now it seems like climate is actually becoming a pretty big hub here with all of the corporate headquarters that are thinking about their scope 3 emissions, or however you want to call it. Your customers are here if you're building in that category. So it's really interesting to think about customer density as a piece of that.
Think about the idea over the last 10 years, and not all, but a lot of the fast growing SaaS companies were SaaS companies that sold to SaaS companies. Think about Brex. Brex dominated the Y Combinator classes time and time again. That is an exact example of why you need customer density, because these face-to-face interactions today, that is a huge benefit and a huge advantage to any startup that's out there. And being in New York, you don't need to go get on a plane and fly to go see your customers. You just need to hop on the 6 train or walk a few blocks, and you can meet with anyone you want.
Yeah, it makes a big difference. What I like about you, Jason, is you come with a prepared mind. And this is something I know you've talked about pretty publicly, the importance of having a prepared mind, the importance of leading with that as you're diligencing a company or meeting young founders. I say young founders, meeting founders early in their career. The age is not relevant. Let's talk about this idea of how you lead with a prepared mind, studying frameworks, understanding past successes. Give me an example of when that's helped you diligence a new investment that you're making, and how it helps you get to a yes quicker.
So I think I've publicly stated that I think 50% of zeros in venture capital are avoidable by just doing more work as both a venture capitalist and as a founder. The reason being is that the amount of research that you can kind of go through to figure out the answers to certain questions can really make you figure out whether or not a business is actually viable. And so I'll give you a couple of different frameworks. One framework that I kind of love to think about is what I call the X for Y framework. So when you take a look back at the history of venture capital, people have made a lot of money with this X for Y derivative. Lee Fixel, what did he go do? When he was 28 years old at Tiger Global, he was flying around the world and he was backing X for Ys. Rocket Internet, same exact thing. Harley Miller did an incredible job doing this before he launched Left Lane. You know, when he was at Insight, he was going around the world and he was backing X for Ys. You know, the Uber of China is worth, what, tens of billions of dollars now? So I think that people, you know, started to do that in its first derivative of X for Y. The second derivative of X for Y is basically thinking about the idea of like, why was a business successful in this industry or in this vertical, and how do I go and try to recreate that business in another vertical, leveraging the same dynamics? Two specific examples. One would be, there was an announcement yesterday about a company called Coast that raised a Series B, right? Well, Coast is basically Brex for blue-collar jobs, or Ramp for blue-collar jobs. That's a very good example of that. Another example would be a company that we invested in called Ply. So we're investors in a business called Dandy. And what Dandy does is they go out and they give away free intraoral scanners. You know when you went to the dentist, by the way, and you had to bite down those putty molds?
Yeah.
You don't need to do that anymore.
My dentist still does that. I did that last month.
Well, you should introduce them to Dandy then.
Okay.
So, Dandy gives away these free scanners. They built software on top of those scanners. And then the scans get done. They send the order to now our manufacturing facility. And then we have this automated line and we send these like very high quality crowns at industry leading prices to dentists. What Ply does is somewhat similar to Dandy. The key insight for Ply there was we go out, we provide free inventory management or very low cost inventory management solutions to these people that own mechanical, electrical, plumbing companies who typically spend 15 hours a week figuring out what inventory they have, what do they need to order, and then they go around and they make all these phone calls. They call local retailers, they call distributors, some have inventory, some don't. They finally get the product in their hands, and then they have to go out and they have to pay 20 different bills. Well, that doesn't make sense. Why don't you just go build software that automates the ordering and figures all of that out for you? Now, by going out and doing that, you're saving people time and you're saving them money. So if you can save people time and you can save people money, that's the winning solution. But really what the key insight was there is you ultimately need to own the demand. And if you own the demand, you can figure out the rest of the value chain in any other industry.
Yeah. What I struggle sometimes with trying to apply that business model for this, right, is understanding the context in which that business model was successful. And I'll give you an example. If we try to apply the models that worked for business like Casper, right, in the D2C boom, well, there were certain dynamics of that time around customer acquisition, around how they did LTV to CAC, how they made their money back on their first sale. We can now look back with the benefit of hindsight and say there were a lot of fast follows that maybe hit that same level of success and probably got out before Casper did. I guess there's market constraints and there's even founder constraints, right? Founder market fit that worked for a certain case study. How do you take that into account when you're kind of evaluating, yes, the business model may be applicable, but then there's other non-connected dynamics that also impacted whether one was successful and the other might not be?
Yeah, so I think a lot of VCs just don't double click into the what actually was super important. One story, I guess, right now, I was with an investor yesterday and they were telling me about how every VC and their mother right now are backing these business in a box companies that are like an Alma for X or a growth therapy for X and Y, because you look at the mental health world and, Alma has been incredibly successful. And why have they been successful? Now, it's not just because it's a business in a box. It's a business in a box that helps therapists grow their business and helps them handle billing and helps them get in network with insurance companies. Now that's the key. So if you go out and you start a business in a box to help somebody go start their own business, it likely won't be as valuable if you're not helping them grow their business and handle a super complex task, which is billings. Now, one other thing I want to mention is that therapy is a massive, massive market with incredibly sticky customers. Not the therapists, yes, they are sticky, but the patients as well. Whereas there have been companies that have been backed more recently in the dietitian space. Now, dietitians is a very good market. It's just not as great of a market as therapy because your insurance company might not cover every single session. They might only cover 5. And so you then have natural churn that is built into the business model, which doesn't make it as sustainable and as massive of an opportunity. So I think it's the double clicking into what actually made a company great and what actually made a market amazing that is the really important job on our side of the table.
No, I think well said. You've said to me that this is a great time to think about AI for small businesses and why SMBs are really going to benefit from the current kind of AI boom that we're in. Let's unpack that a little bit. Why is this the right time for that thesis to play out? And, what gets you excited about this category?
I salivate when thinking about what the next 10 years is going to look like here. There's 5 million small businesses in the United States that are going to change hands over the next decade or so. That's like $10 trillion worth of assets. There's 2 people that are going to make a ton of money in that. One are going to be people that make the acquisitions. That's the private equity firms, the search funds, the random people, on Main Street that, want to become entrepreneurs and acquire those businesses. And then the other field are going to be these venture capital funds and the founders that want to attack that market. The reason being is the biggest returns come from the intersection of a technology change or a platform shift and a demographic shift. And so what you're seeing right now is generative AI is popping up, but you're seeing a lot of these small businesses that probably don't know how to navigate that journey. But when a new owner comes into place and that new owner is maybe younger and more tech forward thinking, they're going to want to change things up. They're going to want to shake it up. And how do they do it? They're going to be able to do it with these next gen AI products. My belief is that vertical software companies, the Service Titans of the world, the House Call Pros of the world, which are unbelievable businesses, by the way, will not be the winners in the next generation. I think the real winners are going to be the businesses that do all of this work for the people buying the companies. Because imagine if you and I can go buy a business on Main Street and all of a sudden it becomes significantly more turnkey, where I don't have to worry about all of the headaches or maybe some of the headaches that even a vertical software company couldn't fix. And now AI has been able to automate a big part of that job. Now we're probably going to want to go out and deploy more capital and buy more companies.
Yeah. The one challenge I've always had looking at the SMB category, and I'm curious for your thoughts on it, is customer acquisition, right? There was a time where Google AdWords and Instagram and all these, tools were pretty effective when you were marketing to SMBs. We've certainly backed companies who launched with that idea of, hey, it's a combination of organic and paid, and we've got some built-in communities. And then the problem happened after the kind of 1 to 2 million ARR point, where they've exhausted their kind of community and exhausted the cheap spend. And now what? Right now, there's no kind of easy customer acquisition hack. And what do? They go hire a VP of sales, they go get some account executives, and suddenly what looked like a very healthy software margin business is being hampered by not effective customer acquisition. So laying that groundwork, why do you think that's going to change going forward in this acquiring SMBs as customers?
I don't necessarily believe that you're ever going to be able to get rid of that SMB go-to-market on-the-ground sales team. I actually think that will always exist. And it is a very, very hard game, which means you need to back exceptional founders. You need to back founders that are going to build a culture that, is, I think somebody told me a story about like the Wolf of Wall Street the other day, and they're like, yeah. Yeah, I mean, like, you got to go down to Main Street. You got to get people like walking around, going into restaurants and selling into owners like they were doing at Toast. I mean, that field sales team was incredible. I mean, the way, if you've ever listened to the chief revenue officer there, speak about how they, divvy up territories and how they incentivize their sales reps, it's really, really incredible stuff. But to go one layer deeper on that, I actually think that the unit economics of Toast, the unit economics of the service titans of the world, those are incredibly differentiated unit economic businesses where the average revenue per customer is actually very high. And so that enables them to fund these go-to-market teams, which is very powerful. And then, this is the big piece, with AI, I actually think it's much more of like an as seen on TV type of thing, where if you can create a beautiful, magical demo where somebody watches it and they're like, whoa, that is ultimately how you're going to help acquire customers and go viral. And if you can bring the cost down, the elasticity of demand will start to increase. And that's really the way that I think about my thesis within like the SMB tech world is you want to go after companies that can drop the price significantly and with a culture that can go to market by selling very hard.
Yeah, I know. I want to be convinced. I think the challenge that I've seen, again, it could just be the portfolio that I've seen or companies that we've seen. Everybody that starts with this product-led idea, they end up going sales-led eventually. Either because they have to move up market because at a certain point, selling 10, 20K ACV contracts isn't attractive. If I'm spending that time, let me go get six figures, right? Let me incentivize my salespeople to actually close those deals. And product-led becomes a great way to get people in the door because they see the demo, they sign up for a sales call, or they maybe want to attend one of your seminars, whatever. And then it just comes back to, if I'm going to sign a six-figure contract, I got to talk to a person and I need to, I'm not going to put my credit card down for something that big. And that's ultimately like the SMB has just never cracked that point. And where I think companies run into trouble, and maybe you've seen it differently in your portfolio, is the availability of downstream capital. When you as a founder are pitching a Series A or even a Series B investor, and you say, the bulk of my market is SMB, you don't get laughed out of the room, but they don't take you as seriously as somebody who's saying, I'm doing six-figure ACV and, look at the sturdiness of my revenue.
It's all about velocity at the end of the day. You look at a company like Dandy. It's a business that sells into dentists. When we pivoted that company, we spent, I think, $500 on Facebook ads. That $500 acquired us 30 dental practices. Those 30 dental practices had average contract values of $30,000. The economics there work out. I mean, you start to bring people in, it can definitely work. And so I think that you just need to have an insane amount of focus. That's the first thing. The second thing is you need to have a massive TAM. I mean, the amount of restaurants in the United States, it's crazy. There's 2.5 million home service companies in the United States. Nobody's going to laugh you out of the room. Now, people hadn't thought about that for a long period of time. Now the market's getting sexy and all of a sudden, VCs are flooding into it. But you can't go after markets in SMB where there's only like 15,000 providers because you'll never be able to crack the nut of generating a return that's going to return, one of our larger seed funds these days.
Yeah, well, we'll talk about fund sizes in a second. You're jumping ahead here. While we're on this topic of prepared mind, there's something that I think you're a kindred spirit on, which is I love doing expert network calls. It's something that may be coming from my, kind of old school banking days and working in corp strat that I find like not a lot of people do. So I know you love doing them. I love doing them. Tell me about maybe an expert call that you've done that changed your perspective on a company or a market.
So it's funny. I worked for Mark Gerson before I joined Primary. Mark was the founder of GLG, Gerson Lehrman Group, which was the OG expert network. And when I worked for him, I was writing 100K, 200K seed checks, but I got to use GLG, and I was like, whoa. Expert networks are amazing. Like, I get to hop on a call and talk to former employees of like all of these companies, and I get to learn about what worked when it came to go-to-market strategy, what was their customer acquisition cost maybe, That sounds amazing. And so, yes, we not only do we use expert networks, by the way, at Primary, but we've actually spun up our own expert network internally and started to build that out, because then we can get people on sales calls and start to hear like how they start to pitch this to people. And are their eyes getting big in the first 30 seconds or 2 minutes of a pitch? Or do they ask a bunch of different questions about the thing that they don't really understand the value of? And it makes it easier to want to pass on that company if you start to hear those things. And so I've done diligence on, for instance, a business of ours called Grips, where I hopped on an expert call and I started to ask them about how they manage data and this is for real estate owners. How do they collect all of the data from different systems, the general contractors, the architecture and engineering firms, and how do they generate all of these reports? And you hear about them logging into 8 different systems every day to generate these reports on a weekly basis and how many hours it takes. And then you learn that the same person used to only manage 2 projects. Now they're managing 10, and that this is the last thing that they want to do. And yeah, there's plenty of errors that happen along the way. And you're like, oh, it's a huge problem. And so I think that the expert network thing is really important. And I think speaking to investment banks, speaking to private equity firms, hedge funds, getting your hands on reports, all of those are critical for seed funds.
Let's double click on this idea of sitting in on sales calls with founders, because that's a pretty unique thing. I know that there are a lot of funds that say, well, we make customer intros while we're going through the diligence process. But you've gone one step further. We will say, I'll listen in on those calls. Can you talk about a particularly memorable one where it either helped you make the investment or, more interestingly, where you heard the founder pitch and you said, hey, maybe this is not for me?
So with Grips, we actually got them on a call with the Rudin organization. And I had reached out to Michael Rudin about this company and mentioned, hey, I'm looking at this business. They're trying to help solve this data issue. Will you be willing to take a call? And he's like, hey, you should chat with this person. We just hired them. They're actually working on this exact project. And so we got on the call, and the founder, Doreen, started to go through this pitch. And before she even was maybe 3 or 4 sentences in, the person just goes, I get it. And part of the thing by doing that was not only did I get to see how the buyer there was grabbing onto it, but it was a level of excitement and then coming up with action items for a next meeting and saying, this is going to be our buying process. Here's what's important to me. And Doreen really reacting to, all of the inbound feedback, taking down, notes, and being super thoughtful about her sales process, that made me get very comfortable, not only with the product, but made me get comfortable with the idea that Doreen would know how to go sell this product into people and scale up a sales team.
Yeah, that's very cool. At Primary, you're very concentrated investors, right? It's 3 to 4 investments per partner per year or something like that? Yes, and I'm guessing part of that is how hands-on you want to be at this kind of early stage. This idea of platform is kind of a dirty word at Primary, as I take it. So let's talk about that. Why is platform the wrong term? We've seen a lot of other funds, friends of ours here in New York, that originated this idea of a platform team that implemented it to varying degrees of efficacy. Why is platform a dirty word at Primary? What do you guys use?
Platform is not allowed to be used at Primary. Our team is our impact team.
Okay.
What's the difference?
Yeah.
We have 3 executives, Cassie Young, Rebecca Price, Lisa Lewin. These are people that ran companies that had multiple hundreds of millions of ARR. Cassie was a chief revenue officer, chief commercial officer at a company called Sailthrough that then got bought by Insight. Rebecca was a chief people officer at Sailthrough and Capsule as well. Lisa was a CEO of a large ed tech company. These are people that then build out teams internally that drive real impact with real KPIs. The way I kind of think about it, going back to AI, is in the vertical software world, they are doing it themselves still. And in platform world, they're like, hey, I'm going to introduce you to so-and-so. Or maybe, I'll throw an event or a dinner. In the impact world, we execute on that. So how do we do that? Recruiting. I just looked at a slide yesterday. Since the beginning of the year, we're sitting here, it's end of March. Our recruiters have saved one portfolio company that we just closed the seed round of $370,000 of recruiting fees and placed people in 75 days. 6 people, all of the key hires since the seed round. That is impact. Impact is also driving real sales. And so we have built a pipeline and ended up helping a portfolio company close about $1.5 million of their initial sales. And the way that we did that was we actually did a bunch of outbound for them, prospecting, because turns out when VCs are sending emails out to potential customers, they tend to get a better response rate. And so we've helped them build up their sales pipeline, which then leads them to higher success rates. And I think and that's a big reason why not only do founders want to work with us at Primary, but it's a big reason why the graduation rate from seed to Series A is twice the industry average at about 90%.
Your graduation rate is 90%. Wow, that's incredible. I guess I'll flip it's on its head a little bit, because I think platform and portfolio support, it gets, I don't know, beat up a little bit on the Twitter and the LinkedIn and the X and whatever we're calling it today. Quite a bit. Well, look, I mean, I'll take it back to Vinod Khosla, right? So Vinod Khosla says most VCs destroy more value than they add. You're here telling me actually a lot of VCs could save their zeros by putting in more work with their companies. I mean, which is it, Jason? Like, if we're seeing so many folks speak so poorly of portfolio support, I mean, can you give me an example of a company that your support has saved from going to zero?
Most VCs do destroy more value than they add. I agree. We have operators who are helping these companies day to day. It's not me jumping in and doing a bunch of the work, because I operated for like 2 years. I always say my first company was great market timing and mediocre market and bad execution. So if you can choose great markets and you have great market timing, you should probably go invest. But so that's why we end up giving these companies the resources to help create more leverage. If a company could end up having a chief revenue officer at the seed, or a chief people officer, or recruiters, and that they had the budget to do that, they're probably going to be able to create more output. So all we're trying to do is help our companies create more output however they want to do it, not the way that we're telling them to do it. And that's a really distinct difference. You know what I mean? Specifically, the example I would give is a company like Dandy. That's a business that when they pivoted, they went from like 0 to 40 in a year or so. It was crazy. And the sales team was growing really quickly to keep up with the growth. The ops team was growing really quickly. Cassie Young jumped in and was like interim chief revenue officer at Dandy for a period of time. My partner, Rebecca, was helping drive a lot of the interviews and the process there to help scale the team from what was only a couple dozen people to 1,000 people in like 2.5 years. I hopped on 100 calls with potential candidates that they were trying to recruit, helping them close. And by doing those types of things day to day, you're not changing the strategy in a big way. You're not distracting the founders. You're just saying, you tell me where you want me to go, what you want me to do, and I'll do that. And that's the fundamental difference from a lot of the noise on Twitter and what people are actually referring to.
What are their incentives for doing that? Because these are folks, and again, we're talking the abstract, right? But we could probably link a couple of these tweets in the show notes. People from big funds say, back really great founders and get out of their way. And I know that's not the ethos at Primary. So I'm curious, what are those incentives for folks that are slamming this idea of portfolio support and VC value add? And why are those incentives, set in that way?
Let's just use numbers. So if we manage $1 billion today or whatever it is, and, another seed fund manages $1 billion today, you have about, what is that? $20 million of fees that you can use? Okay. Well, we spend $4.5 million of those fees every single year on our impact team. Well, if another seed fund doesn't have an impact team and there's, let's say, 4 partners, they're each paying themselves another $1.1 million a year. So yeah, I think the incentives are not aligned for you to say that an impact team is not worth it or portfolio support is not worth it.
Yeah. Yeah, look, I mean, some of this in VC just comes down to, there's a set amount of management fees that you work off of. And look, we're a much smaller fund. We think about every one of those dollars that, we can spend, and then we come back and say, how much can we pay us, right? You have seen, I'd say in 2021 especially, the number of massive funds that have been raised where you kind of just go, I mean, these guys are totally fine living on the management fees. I mean, they don't even have to think about carry. And it always makes me wonder about the LPs that are in those funds and how they're feeling about it.
I really struggle with that. We're a firm that is just insanely hungry and insanely competitive and building for the future. And I think a lot of the great seed funds that have scaled up both fund size, but also their teams, they tend to run in the red for a period of time and they're burning capital, but they're burning it because they fundamentally believe in their core mission, the way that they're approaching the job. Whereas if the incentives aren't aligned and you are paying yourself the extra $1 million a year, and so now you're making, north of $2 million a year, how hungry are you really? I do wonder that, actually. Because, I don't know, how much money do people really need? And, where's the fire in your belly to go write a $2.5 million check or to get on a plane to go meet with a founder for a second meeting because you heard a local fund is looking at that deal? It's just not there. And whereas at Primary, we're not going to make our money off fees. I'm telling you that. We're going to make our money off carry, and that's why every single person that works at Primary because they're betting on the long run. And they're betting on building a firm that's going to be the best firm in the world.
Yeah. Why do you think the LPs do it then? Put you in the mind of, you pitch to LPs as you guys are raising your funds. Think about them. Why are they coming after these multi-billion-dollar funds when the carry opportunity isn't as clear as somebody who's young, scrappy, and early?
Are you asking why LPs give us money or why LPs are giving money to funds that are...
I think your pitch is pretty clear. It's look, we're going to get in there and we're going to help these companies, and we have a track record of doing it. I'm saying there are folks on, Fund 8, Fund 9, Fund 10, whether here in New York or in the Valley, raising multi-billion dollars. Is the math there? I'm curious why the LPs get behind that.
Really for 2 reasons. One is incentives, and then the second one is based off of the stage and the returns. So the first, in terms of incentives, a lot of larger LPs, whether it be pension funds or endowments, they might not have massive teams built out to go and attack the venture asset class. So it might be easier for them to give capital to, 1 or 2 managers. And they look at, these larger funds as potentially an index of the asset class. That's one. The second is multi-stage funds. You can give a multi-stage fund capital, and they might not need a portfolio impact team because a company's already proven their ability to execute. They've already gotten that leverage out of a firm like Primary. They're already accelerating their growth. There's not that much to do. So yeah, you really are just a capital allocator versus a value-added partner. So most of the value from those people will come out in the boardroom.
Yeah. Speaking of multi-stage funds, I've heard you say that the only deals that you've lost in the last year have been to multi-stage funds. Does it just come down to price, or is it something else that founders look for from these multi-stage funds?
It's price. It's price, and they think that they're going to be able to, get that firm to go and do the Series A. I think it's a dangerous game to play. Let's think about where we're at right now. We just went through an era in a ZERP era, where prices of companies got out of control. And think about how many companies in both of our portfolios that probably raised at way too high valuations and now need to go out and raise a flat round or a down round. Most VCs are lazy. It is hard to have to go in, look at a company, say, okay, I like this business, but your last round was done at this price. Now I need you to go convince all of your other investors, or you need to go convince all of your other investors to take a down round price. It's the brain drain of that and the amount of extra time and attention it takes when you could just be looking at that like sexy AI deal over on the other side. It's really hard and people just don't want to do the work. Now, if they are willing to do the work, I actually think there's a lot of money to be made, but most people won't.
Yeah. I always tell founders about the signaling risk. I mean, it was all well and good when, our friends at Andreessen were marking up Clubhouse from their seed to their A to their B. And, you got one person to convince when you need to go get that up round and it'll galvanize the rest of the cap table. But the flip side is you get your seed from one of these folks that typically writes $10 to $20 million checks, and they wrote you a $2 million check. And if you need a bridge or you need just some FaceTime with the GP who's going to make that call to a prospective hire, you got 20 million over here, you got 2 million over here. You're really expecting the same level of attention?
Here's my analogy for you. I want you to imagine you own 2 homes, okay? You own one home that's a $2 million home, and then you own another home that's a $50 million home. If you find out that both of those homes are on fire and you can only go save one of them, which one are you going to go save?
The bigger one, obviously.
Well, that's the world we're living in right now.
It is interesting. I mean, look, I think some of this is, slightly self-serving. We're both seed investors. We're working with the same set of founders. I'm sure if like our buddy David Haber from Andreessen was over here, he would say, look, there's a value to having a firm that's got all these companies and the scale and the size and all that kind of stuff. But I mean, it sounds like it ultimately just comes down to price.
I will not use any names, but I've seen and heard stories about multi-stage fund investors not even showing up to board meetings like anymore when companies are going through challenging things because of the other stuff going on in their portfolio, or they just send an analyst or associate to take their spot. Because when things get hard and seed is not your core business, you're not going to end up wanting to support the company and figuring things out. You're just going to say, okay, it's time for me to move on and go spend my time elsewhere where it's more valuable.
Yeah. That's not to knock on associates and principals. Having been that myself and having been sent to some of those board meetings, those companies turned out fine. But you're right. No, look, I think you're right. Right. The constraint on an investor is not money; it's time, and the constraint for a founder, in fact, is also not money; it's time. And how you get the people you need to spend that time on you is ultimately the big challenge that the CEO has once they've taken care of the kind of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. They've got the money, they've got the team. Now you need time and attention, and ultimately that becomes the challenge.
I completely agree with you. By the way, and I'm not knocking the fact that somebody else is going to go pay more attention to the thing that they have $50 million into. I mean, like, you have to help your LPs. You have to be thinking about your LPs because they are another big major customer base. But because this is A, our core business, and B, we care. We really, really deeply care, or at least like everyone on my team deeply, deeply cares. I can't imagine walking away from a founder and leaving them out to dry just because the road gets bumpy. Because I've also seen those bumpy roads become unicorns. So if you do strap in and you dig in and you figure things out, things can turn around, as much as other people on Twitter want to say that only the best companies are up and to the right.
We could talk about an example from our shared portfolio. So Brad and Alloy, we invested in that round when I was at my last fund, Launch Capital, in 2015, and it took them really until 2019, I would say, to crack true product market fit. And they were doing the right things all along, but it was kind of linear growth. And then a couple of unlocks, a couple of product unlocks, some of the right team members around the table, and Brad, Nahal at ENIAC, us at Launch Capital. I mean, we believed, but that belief took 4 years to really manifest, and a couple of bridge rounds, and it finally got there.
I will tell you a story that was amazing. I haven't spent that much time with Tommy Nicholas from Alloy, but he came to one of our investor days, and he went through this presentation, and he pulled up a revenue chart. And, you say linear, it might have been like pretty close to flat.
Flat, yeah. I was being generous.
And, pretty close to flat, and then like skyrocketed up into the right. And Tommy, in front of our, LPs and prospective LPs, was like, talking about the support that you guys gave, that Brad gave. And then he looks at the chart and he goes, and primary wrote checks here, and then like a dot popped up above a flat line. And here, another flat line. And then here, and another flat line. And he's like, but the thing is, and this is actually goes back to portfolio impact. By having people work super closely with these companies, we see and we hear the things that are going on day to day. We see how fast they're moving, what they're learning, and it helps us build conviction with asymmetric amounts of information to make those smart decisions.
That's been one of the really cool things about what we've been building at VSC as well is, again, we lean on one very specific thing, which is PR and storytelling. But we're spending time with these founders as they're navigating their story. They're navigating the story they tell to customers, how it differs from what they're putting out in the press, what it differs from what they're telling their employees. And you start to pick up on these things a lot earlier than the board partner even, because we don't lead rounds in Fund 1. And so there's been times where we're on these calls and we're talking about something completely different, and the founder mentions something offhand, and you go, wait, that's really exciting. That customer is interested. Let's get everybody on a call. Let's talk about how we help you close that, because that's a game-changing inflection point. And again, it comes back to time, right? Are you spending that time? We had Sunil Nagaraj from Ubiquity Ventures, a Bay Area investor, on the show, and he talked about the fact that board meetings happening every 3 months is a detriment to the founder. And he goes, a lot of folks, they think you need to wait 3 months, and there's this big board presentation. And he goes, I have monthly check-ins, and they're short. They're almost like stand-ups, but we do them every month so people don't forget what happened, when you do it every 3 months. And as a result, we catch problems. We don't wait 90 days, and then we all get in a room and go, well, why wasn't this brought up sooner? It's like, well, we thought we had a board meeting coming. We talk about it then. I think it's just a fundamentally different way that folks who have spent as much time in seed as we have think about spending time with companies, whereas the classic A, B growth round, you probably only need to meet every 3 months.
I have a saying internally that I tried to tell to all of the new junior investors, which is I never want to walk into a board meeting and learn something new. I meet with founders, for 30 minutes every single month in the portfolio that I work with. And I probably text every founder in the portfolio at least every week or every other week. And we do portfolio review meetings every other week. So it's a wonderful forcing function to make sure that we're on top of things. And then by having people working with the companies, they're collecting more and more information, more data points. And I'm then getting briefed on these data points on a biweekly basis. And that helps a ton, because 3 months is eternity. I mean, what are you're going to have 6 board meetings during the course of your runway? That's crazy.
Is there ever an investment in your career that you were so confident was going to be successful, but ultimately failed?
I think we go into every investment where you're super confident that they'll be successful. Maybe that's not a good way to think about it, but you need to, especially when you're only writing 3 checks a year. I've only lost one company since I joined Primary. And I think back on that investment, what did I get wrong? I think the market itself was still great, is still great. But unfortunately, I think I got enamored and married to the market. And then the team that we ended up backing, unfortunately, it was an unbelievably challenging business to operate. The complexity was insane. And the amount of financial rigor and controls you needed to have in place to be able to run that business were super, super complicated. And it wasn't a team that had really operated before or scaled businesses before. It was first-time founders with barely any operating experience, if any at all. And, unfortunately, I think just the wheels came off, and they weren't able to recognize where they needed to put out fires that were the most important.
Yeah. Given 2 options, first-time founder but with industry founder market fit, or a second-time founder but doesn't know the industry that well, who would you take a bet on?
Second-time founder who's insanely hungry and still has a learning, mentality, I love. Founder market fit is incredible, but I want to answer that in a different way. I will never back a great founder in a bad market, because the market will keep its reputation and the founder won't.
What's a piece of advice you find yourself giving founders that doesn't get taken often enough?
Reach out to as many people as you can who have basically been on the same path as you, in the same industry as you, meaning every week, wake up, email 3 people that did the thing that you're doing or worked on the thing you're working on and have solved those pain points before. Chances are all of the tests that you're going to run have probably been run before, or a lot of them certainly have. And so if you can skip months of learning by just reaching out to the right person, I think it's going to save you a lot of headaches.
Why don't you think more founders do that? I mean, it seems like really great and semi-obvious advice, right? Learn from the wisdom of the crowd. Why don't more people do that?
Ego. I think it's ego. I mean, why else would it be? I mean, it's a vulnerable state to be like, I'm going to go reach out to all these people and like pick their brains or whatever. Or it's that and a lot of founders, some of the best founders in the world, I mean, most of the best founders in the world, they're unbelievably confident. And they're like, I'll figure it out on my own. And like, when you're a founder and you're a CEO, you are highly self-sufficient. You're highly independent. And that makes a lot of sense. You have to be. But you also need to know when to ask for help. And so I think the best founders in the world are insanely confident, but also have a beginner's mind.
It's a great place to leave it, Jason. That's, I think, a wonderful message for any of our listeners, be they investors, be they founders. Come in with a prepared mind, but have a beginner's mind as well to make sure that you're not letting your ego get in the way of your growth. So I want to thank you so much for joining me on Climb and for sharing your experience and your insights with us. It's been really fun.
Appreciate it, man. We came full circle there.
Really, we did.
Thank you.
Well, that's it for this week's episode of Climb by VSC. Thank you so much for watching and listening. My thanks to my friend Jason Shuman for joining me on Climb this week. Did you know that you can watch as well as listen to every episode of Climb? We put every episode out on YouTube in addition to Spotify and Apple, and you can watch clips every single day. Keep on scrolling. If you like this episode, we'd love for you to leave us a 5-star review. And if you really love this episode, recommend a guest to us. We'd love to have them on the show. Well, that's all for now. Thank you so much for joining me on Climb by VSC. We'll see you all next week.